Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of our series. And today we are going to be talking about how we can use hip fracture to really help us understand how important nutrition is. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about hospital food, both from the wards and on the news. I can imagine primarily it's about how appetizing or unappetizing patients may find meals, or how patients aren't eating enough. But what we really want to discuss today is how important is nutrition in the care of patients who come in with a hip fracture.
Hello everyone. I keep saying this, surgery and anaesthesia for hip fracture are now so successful that they're rarely the reason why people have poor outcome. We need to look for aspects of care that are not done well if we want to try and improve outcome. Nutrition's one of those topics. So what were you taught about nutrition as a medical student?
If I'm being completely honest, it wasn't a whole amount. I think we have a lot of problem-based learning at the moment in medical school, and in terms of nutrition, I learned maybe what vitamins, so a lack of vitamin C can lead to scurvy, and what vitamins are important, and maybe some very basic protocol guidelines, but that's pretty much the extent of my learning.
Okay, well, I hope they taught you about vitamin D, but we'll cover that on a later podcast. And you can go to NICE to get guidance on how we should be organising nutrition, but it's much more complicated than that. And there's a whole range of issues that we need to think about. And I think the nutrition and frailty are wrapped up in each other. The original Freed paper describing frailty, the phenotype of frailty, sort of put together a picture of a deteriorating spiral of decline of patients not getting enough food, so getting weaker, getting sarcopenia, and because their muscles are weaker, they're less able to look after themselves, less able to feed themselves, cook for themselves, becoming more malnourished, and a vicious circle of deterioration. And that's one sort of model of frailty that we need to find a way to try and challenge. So where would you go to find evidence on how do we do nutrition?
I know there's the Cochrane study. I think you mentioned that previously.
Yeah, so that's where I started. Go and get somebody who's really organised to look at the literature in a very structured fashion and tell you. And when I started looking at hip fracture patients, there were 20 trials of nutritional supplementation in the Cochrane analysis. And that's more than there were of many aspects of hip fracture care. There's always been recognised that nutrition is really important. There are more trials of anaesthesia and metalwork from orthopaedic surgeons than of nutrition, but there was a lot about nutrition. It was recognised as being a problem. In the Cochrane database, there were trials offering protein supplementation, calorie supplementation, and nasogastric feeding were the sort of issues that were discussed. But the problem with the studies was these are not big drug trials. These were small trials, relatively poorly funded, offering extra nutrition to people and able to show that perhaps their albumin improved, but translating that into a real outcome difference, better recovery or survival figures, just wasn't viable within the study. So Cochrane was really uncertain about what was going on.
And why was the evidence for nutrition so poor? I know we talked briefly on our rehab podcast about how obvious problems don't have good evidence particularly. Is it something similar here?
Yes, again, you're not going to make a lot of money by running a trial of nutritional supplementation in the way you would for a drug company. So we don't have the same funding, but there's also not the same requirement to prove that things that aren't drugs are necessarily effective. So it's very much softer area and really challenging to deal with.
But isn't it obvious that if you don't have the correct amount of energy, don't have the correct amount of protein, carbohydrates, fats, you're not going to get better?
Yeah, and we're not good at doing trials to prove the obvious. And when I started, we used to have postmortems on pretty much everybody who died when I started, either hospital postmortems or coroner postmortems. And I'd go to the postmortem and you'd find that she died after weeks in hospital, and there wasn't really anything particularly wrong. I was worried I'd missed a pneumonia or a coronary or something like that, but there was often nothing wrong with the patient. And it was the dietitian on the ward, Donna Duncan, who explained to me that I hadn't looked at how much the patient weighed, and that people were losing weight throughout their time in hospital, losing muscle, the muscle they would use to stand up and get back onto their feet. That was just being lost. And if you become malnourished, your morale suffers, your mood suffers, your appetite suffers, and your physical ability suffers. So people were just fading away, and then their immune system would be suppressed, and they would slip away with relatively little apparently wrong with them. They just seemed to give up and fade away. And that remains an issue in many wards, in many hospitals around the country, around the world. People fading away with really unrecognised problems with nutrition. And Donna and I spent a number of years competitively doing studies to prove things to each other. And we did very simple studies. So we looked at doing a nutritional risk score on patients when they came in, and were able to show that the nutritional risk score identified the people who were likely to die during their time in hospital. She developed a WASP score, which is a nutritional risk score like the M&A, like the MUST score, which people may be familiar with, as a way of trying to identify people who are at high risk for attention. We looked at whether the results of that predicted outcome and showed that it did in the same way. And in response to all of that, we then said, well, what are we going to do with care on the ward?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what did you do once you got all that evidence and nutrition, and how important it was, and how do you really implement it into the ward?
Yeah, so we think supplements will work. We're not got good evidence, but let's give everybody supplements. We'll make sure that everybody has a risk assessment done, that we're all aware of what's going on. We had a really low threshold for putting nasogastric tubes into people and trying to encourage those who seem to be at high risk, and that's what we did. And
with this approach, what were the results?
It didn't work. So what we did, what Donna did, was to employ a couple of dietetic students on some holiday, and they weighed all the food going into the patients on the ward. So even with us taking this really seriously, they weighed the food that people were given and the food that was taken away at the end of meals, which wasn't eaten. They weighed the supplements that people did and didn't take. And they showed that essentially, on average, patients recovering from hip fracture were on about half the number of calories, half the amount of protein that they needed to survive. So there's recommended daily allowance that you have on the back of your cornflakes packet. They were getting half that.
So basically half the calories and half of everything.
Yes. And they came in with their batteries half charged, and we just ran them down. So if somebody made a good recovery quite quickly, they would get out and get back to their normal life, and they'd be okay. But if you were in hospital for any length of time, your batteries just ran down and it became really challenging.
And is there any way that you really tackled that? So you've got the evidence that people are getting essentially half of the food that they need. How did you go about actually making sure they got the 100% or as close to 100%?
Yeah, so the issue was, well, we can't do what it said in Cochrane because we've done that, and it still isn't enough to try and rescue these people. So one of the things that happens is if you go and look at what people are being offered in hospital, it's cheap. There's not a lot of money invested in it. There's no RCT evidence that food works. So I can spend a fortune on drugs on a ward round, but I can't really influence the very small amount of money that's spent on hospital catering. But though you find that patients living on soup, they like soup, but actually you can peer into their bowl of soup and you can see the bottom because it's salt and water with a bit of flavouring. It's not nourishing, protein-rich broth. They like porridge for breakfast. Lots of patients having porridge for breakfast, but if that's made with water, you're missing an opportunity to get milk, to get calories into it. And one of the things that we did was to try and re-engineer the foods so that there was protein supplementation being put into the soups, put into the porridge and that sort of thing, milk additives. And there's a beautiful study from Australia talking about milk supplementation of the diet of people in institutional care. It's one of the very few trials that anybody's ever done that shows that an intervention can influence patients' risk of falling and fracturing in institutional care. So we know that supplementation of food will work, but it has to be a systematic approach, and it's really difficult to maintain that. And when the budgets are cut, you find that patients are no longer being offered biscuits at tea time. They're no longer being offered a milky drink at bedtime. Things just get trimmed off. And unless somebody's fighting for that, it's really quite difficult. Lovely work from Nottingham, from Professor Sahota in Nottingham, who's developed an ice cream as a supplement. So putting lots of energy and calories into patients in a form that they like to take. And that sort of an innovative idea was the sort of thing we tried to do, making sure that people got the opportunity. And it made a little bit of a difference to people's protein and calorie intake back around the millennium. But we were still struggling. The other thing that Lindsay Bradley, who's one of the staff nurses on the ward, pointed out was that when meals are delivered to a patient, the patient could be asleep, the meal's put in front of them. If they don't wake up during that time, it just gets cold and it gets taken away. They may not be able to see properly, they may not be able to hold cutlery properly, they may struggle just with the whole process of eating. And what she did was develop the concept of a red tray. So instead of food being delivered on an ordinary tray, it was delivered on a red tray. And that moved responsibility for the patient eating to the nurses, back to the nurses in the way that it would be back in Florence Nightingale's time, back to the nurse being responsible for this person getting the food that they need to make sure that they were eating better. And that's an initiative that's been seen around the UK since then.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it really puts the emphasis on making sure that the nurses and the rest of the NDT are involved in making sure the patient eats properly, and it's not just something that the dietitian writes down in the patient's ward notes.
Yeah. So we thought we'd got this right. We thought we knew what we were doing. We're doing things that were as innovative as we could possibly manage, and then it all went horribly wrong because my grandmother broke her hip and came into my ward under my care. And that was fine, she was lovely. But the real problem was that my mother immediately appeared on the hospital ward to look after her. And that's a truly terrifying experience when your mother starts supervising how you're providing care on your ward. Because she just ran a coach and horses of criticism through the way in which feeding was done in hospital. Pointing out that my grandmother would never eat something like that. She wouldn't like that. She wouldn't be able to do that. And actually coming in at meal times to feed her when she was unable to feed herself. And that was a terrifying experience, but it was a great way of really judging what was going on. And what we decided, Donna and I decided after that experience, was that we ought to try and bottle it. Now, both my mother and my grandmother worked for the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, so they spent time working in hospitals, pushing a trolley around to offer chocolates and biscuits to patients in their volunteering hats. And we talked to the WRVS in the hospital, and they provided us with a small amount of money to employ 2 dietetic assistants. Not dietitians, not trained at all, but 2 dietetic assistants, and their job was essentially to do what Mum did for Granny when she was in hospital. So they would work with the dietitian to make sure that patients were properly assessed. They would try and support the people who the dietitian was concerned about. So they would make sure that the right food was ordered with the catering staff. They would make sure that supplements were available, and they would physically help people with choosing the right meal and physically feeding some of the people, the frailest people. So we thought that would be a really great intervention. But because we were already auditing every patient who comes through the system using the forerunner to the National Hip Fracture Database, we could monitor the outcome for those patients. So what we did was we randomized patients to this dietetic assistant or to ordinary care. And we ran a randomized controlled trial on a budget of practically nothing, just using audit data to monitor what the impact was. And what we found was that there was an improvement in patients' outcomes in terms of mortality. Mortality on the ward halved. Mortality at the 4-month follow-up was halved. So there's a very dramatic impact for those patients.
So these patients who had the dietitian assistants, people who aren't really trained, just around them and making sure that they ate food, being personal with them, had their mortality halved.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It is. Nobody else has ever done an RCT in hip fracture care that's had that sort of level of impact. You can't do it because with orthopaedic interventions, it's just not going to work like that. But you can where there's such a big issue. Care back then was poorer than it is now. I'm not saying that we would get the same impact if we did the same trial now. So I wouldn't be convinced that we would achieve the same thing now. But I think we might achieve quite a lot. How did it work was almost as interesting as the fact that it did, because we could measure that people ate a bit more. There was a bit more supplement went into people. They ate a little bit more, but we did measure that. It wasn't a huge difference. What was different was the patient satisfaction. They were happier. And the interaction between the patient and somebody who was only coming in to talk to you about things that were nice, about meal times, and to be with you and chat to you while you're in the meal, to encourage you and be positive. That interaction, like the interaction between my mum and my grandmother, was hugely supportive for some of the patients, some of the frailest patients. And we randomised people with dementia in this study. So supporting the people who are at greatest risk, the very frailest, could be hugely impactful. So maybe it shows that intervention to try and support them is worth doing, or maybe it just shows that actually if we step away from traditional models of care, if nurses spend more time filling in forms and less time working with the patients, if the family are excluded from the ward, we have protected meal times that sort of discourage relatives from coming in to be with their relatives at meal times. Maybe all of those sort of attitudes will lead to a deterioration in care. And the value that nurses, everybody should place on feeding people in hospital, I think was beautifully demonstrated by that study.
It's interesting. I think the role of the family and feeding is definitely really important. I remember I was doing a hospital placement in India, and for about 75-80% of the patients, they had their daughter or their son or a granddaughter with the patient almost all the time. And I think, as you were saying, that seems like it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that the frailty of the patient is going to be the determinant of their recovery, and the expert in the frailty of the patient is the family. They know all of the frailties. They know we get the history of all of the frailties and the problems that these patients have. So it's Grace's daughter who will understand her best and give us the best grasp of how to approach looking after her. So she needs to be there. She's a much more useful geriatrician than I am, and we need to make sure that around the world we don't move to a model where geriatricians are viewed as the panacea for all ills. We need to have staff encouraging the family and working with the family to have a proper understanding of patient frailty to work together. We've done the same. Mike Reed in Northumbria took the same model of nutritional support and ran that in a hip-quip trial and across a number of other hospitals, and showed similar benefits. It's not just something that happened here. So it's worth doing this, and nutrition really is an area where the whole team can enjoy. It's nice feeding people, and I have to say that some of the most fulfilling moments of my career are when I'm sitting feeding somebody who's not able to feed themselves, and to see them sort of becoming animated. It's only trumped by seeing the other members of staff seeing you doing it, and the nurses and the healthcare assistants who are doing that on a daily basis, seeing how much you recognise the importance of it. And the best thing to happen in the world is when the daughter comes in and sees you feeding her mother. Really engaging with people and showing that nutrition matters is fundamentally important to patient outcome.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think taking that and some of the key lessons is really important. Even maybe taking that home with the patient once they're back home, making sure they're eating properly. But yeah, again, thank you very much for the overview of nutrition. I think it's one of the best podcasts, my favourite podcast of the series so far. And we look forward to you all tuning in for the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.